Good morning, and thank you for joining us here for Live Impact News. I'm Eugene Daniel in our streaming studio in Hampton Roads, Virginia, 13 News Now, joined by producer Sarah Calloway across from me and meteorologist Craig Moeller here as we are now hours away from the big launch out of Cape Canaveral in Florida for Artemis II, sending astronauts to the moon for the first time in 50 or so years. 4 astronauts will be making that track. They're going to be traveling faster, farther, and a couple of firsts as well amongst them as well. As you take a live look right there at the Kennedy Space Center, it looks really good out there, Craig. I know yesterday we spent a long time talking about the conditions and all of the things that have to be just right for them to go.
You know,
it's looking good.
Even where they sit right now, and I know we're going to come back and talk more forecast stuff a little bit later about the Artemis II, but what you're seeing right now, they are about 3 hours into a 5-hour bulk fueling process. They started that around 7 a.m. Do you know how much fuel they put on that rocket? What the capacity is?
I can only imagine. How much? Do you know?
700,000 gallons.
Golly.
I mean, I thought it cost a lot to fill up my truck. At $4 a gallon now, I'm like, what? All right, 700,000 gallons. I don't think I will be complaining too much about my next fuel bill. Anyway, I thought that was fascinating. They had to get the temperatures right and stable. All of that has been checked off. It's all good. So they're over halfway through the bulk fueling stage of this process.
Love that. Well, look, It looks good there down in Florida, but you know what? It doesn't look too bad here. It actually looks really good in Hampton Roads. What's our forecast shaping up to be today and the next few days, Craig?
We're looking at record heat today. Temperatures up low to mid 80s. The existing record is 83. That was set originally back in 1978. When Eugene was but a twinkle in his father's eye.
Maybe not.
There you go. I was going to say, I was running around as a 10-year-old at that point. At any rate, we tied it in 2016. Today, I think we're going to get up around 84 for an official high. You see various times kind of along the graph there. By noon, 78, 2 o'clock temperatures near 82, and it will continue to warm as we go. As we take a look, what you're going to find across the area, we're going to find the temperatures continuing to be quite warm all the way through the Easter weekend. Low 80s tomorrow, near 80 Friday, Saturday around 80, 81 on Sunday. There will be increasing clouds and a chance for rain late in the day on Easter. Early Easter, sunrise services, morning activities. Maybe you go to church and have lunch plans or brunch with the family, or maybe you do an Easter egg hunt. So much fun with the little ones, getting them outside midday on Easter. You should be good. But late in the day, that's when we could see some more showers. All right, we do have some high clouds out there. You can see that is cirrus cloud cover that we're spotting from the Thompson Creek Window Company Skyview. We're at 71, southwest winds at 16 miles per hour. We have seen some higher gusts. Gusts are actually reaching close to 30 around Norfolk and 26 at Currituck. Wallops with a gust to 25. We've also seen a gust close to 30, officially 29 there in Virginia Beach. That's an extreme close-up. It's like Wayne's World. Hang on a second. There we go. We'll bring it back. Basically, we are looking at these breezy conditions, especially near the coast, and we'll continue to watch that. Now, as we take a look at the central U.S., we've got to talk severe weather, and the potential is pretty good. There's a level 3 or an enhanced threat from North Texas into Oklahoma and Kansas. I also want to note that in northern Virginia, up into Maryland and Delaware, we also have an elevated risk for stronger storms. You'll note the tornado potential out west. That's from Texas into Oklahoma and Kansas. Also, northern Kentucky into West Virginia, southern Ohio. Wouldn't be out of the question to see an isolated tornado or two, but the better chances back in the central part of the country. For Kansas, the Wichita area down through central Oklahoma and into North Texas around Abilene, some of those areas in north central Texas, they also have to worry about large hail and very gusty winds. Those winds out in that part of the country could gust in excess of 75 miles per hour. We here in Hampton Roads, just off to our north, have a lower risk, but still a risk for a few stronger wind gusts. So as we zoom in, you'll note our immediate viewing area, southeast Virginia and northeast North Carolina, not included in this wind outlook from the from the Storm Prediction Center, but we do have those potential for some gusty winds if you're traveling up to Richmond, up through Tappahannock. Certainly as you go up towards D.C. or Charlotte, you head up towards Harrisonburg, some of the different areas off to the north, we could find some of those stronger storms developing late. So we'll watch for that. Right now, the wet weather is far to the north and northwest. That's where we also find a frontal boundary. For our area, what we'll find southwest winds, and those winds are going to be breezy. It's going to drive our temperatures up in the lower to mid 80s through the afternoon. Overnight tonight, mainly clear conditions to partly cloudy. Slight chance of a shower or storm off to the north. You don't see it much with this graph model that I'm showing you. Low 80s for tomorrow, more sunshine. As I mentioned, Friday looks good as well. Now today's high, close to 84. Again, mostly sunny to partly sunny. We do have the high clouds, and those winds are a bit gusty. Tonight's low near 64, and then tomorrow we're going to be back up around 82 with mostly sunny skies, obviously staying warm. Beyond that, we see the temperatures continuing close to 80, as I mentioned, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday near 81. Behind the front that comes through late Sunday, and that triggers some rain chances, we are going to see the temperatures so much cooler. Monday and Tuesday, low 60s, low to mid 60s, I'd say maybe 64, 65 on Wednesday, and then staying in the mid to upper 60s Thursday and Friday. So we go from low 80s back into the 60s. The normal high is 65, so we really can't complain too much as we get back close to average next week. But if you like the warmer weather, take advantage of it now. It's feeling very, very spring-like.
It is feeling spring-like. I will tell you what, there have been some days, Craig, where it's almost, dare I say, summer-like, honestly.
Yeah, well, today, if we hit 84, I mean, you get into the mid-80s, and yeah, you're feeling summer-like.
Yeah, what's the song by Childish Gambino? It's a feeling in the streets on a day. It feels like summer.
I thought you were going to break it to summertime.
I should have.
You
Jazzy Jeff and Will. Yeah,
Come on.
I should have for sure. Yeah, I missed that opportunity. But both
Gambino's
great.
You're
Both
good. You're good.
Great
All right.
songs.
Hey, you guys want to talk about the Artemis II? You guys
I would
know,
love to. Let's bring back that live shop.
I have been so excited about this, right? I'm going to, first of all, let's take a look at the national map because I want to zoom in, show you a few sprinkles, then we'll go back to the Kennedy Space Center. As we zoom in down towards Cape Canaveral right now, you can see on the Space Coast, a few sprinkles offshore. Again, there's nothing heavy there, no strong storms or anything. As we take a little closer look, again, they are still offshore from Cape Canaveral. That live picture was showing you some sunshine, maybe a little bit of a thin veil of clouds out there, a little bit of a haze if you want to take a picture of Artemis II. There it is on the launch pad, ready to go. They are in that fueling process right now. And as far as this evening goes, the actual conditions still with an 80% probability of favorable weather. Talk about temperatures. Need to be below 95 or 94.5 and above about 38 to 41 degrees. We're going to be in that window. We're expecting temps in the 70s. We are not anticipating any precipitation at that point. There's only a 10% chance. So, again, it's not a 100% no problems at all kind of a thing, but 80% probability is pretty good. And because of that, because they were able to get the tanks to a good stable temperature this morning, they're in that fueling, that bulk fueling process as we speak. So they are, as you say, kind of locked and loaded. They're ready to go at this point. Of course, if there is anything that is deemed hazardous, the mission director can cancel. It's kind of the wild card at any moment if any weather parameter were to change. But at this point, there's no solar activity that's extenuating, nothing that would create problems with communication or mess with any of the instrumentation. So they're really excited about this. Winds are going to be cooperative. Everything is looking good. You're looking at the crew right there. That video, just awesome, coming from NASA. I feel like we're getting to really know the crew. We have the various astronauts there. You were talking about some of the firsts.
There are several firsts in this particular mission. You have the first African-American who's going to go to the moon, the first woman who's going to go to the moon, and the first Canadian that will be going to the moon. In terms of the distance, I believe they are going further than any other team has gone, and they're going to be traveling faster than any other team has gone. So there are all kinds of just pieces of history that are being marked by this particular mission. And of course, obviously, it's to the moon. First time we've done that in 50 years.
And
but this crew is going to be setting some major history.
I do want to make one thing clear, because some folks may be casually hearing about this. Maybe you're coming in and you found us here on Live Impact News and you're hearing, oh, the moon mission. I didn't realize this was going on. If you haven't already been following this story, they are not going to do a lunar landing. When we say to the moon, they're actually going to loop around the moon and come back, but they're going to be on the far side of the moon. You remember Apollo 13, they had to use the moon, go to the far side, and slingshot back around. This is going back there with intention this time. And the plan is to go around and kind of get a good look at the moon, survey. They're going to try to get a look. The goal here ultimately is to establish lunar base there on the moon, probably closer to the southern pole. That is the idea there, as they believe that's going to be the most hospitable location for a potential base here, and a longer term base. I mean, this to me is just mind-blowing that we are talking about actually setting up a lunar base
that
we
our
can
minds
go to and
are literally looking. It's one thing to, I mean, since we were kids, there have been cartoons and the sci-fi movies that talk about having some form of colony or something on the moon. We've always thought of this, right? But we're actually thinking about being on the moon. I mean, if you it's
well,
incredible.
And again, it's about staying there.
Yes,
that is really wild, because we've had astronauts on the moon. Those first steps, captivated, and the amount of money and the amount of human energy that went on to getting those astronauts. And you think about all of the technological advancements that we have made in the last 50 years. I mean, the video, the imagery, what we're going to be able to glean from these trips, the upcoming missions here. This isn't just about getting back to the moon. This is really setting up the next jump potentially to Mars and beyond.
Yeah.
So, this is one of those things that when I was a kid, we used to dream about this. They said, oh, in your lifetime, you'll see people traveling back and forth to the moon regularly. And we were like, really?
Yeah.
And then I remember when they got away from the moon exploration. I was a little kid when they were doing the Apollo missions. But when they went to the space shuttle, we thought, oh, this is amazing, because we're going to be able to land and take off. It was more like, that type of a deal. But in a way, I was kind of sad, because I wanted to keep going back to the moon. I was like, wait, when are we going back to the moon?
And I think to me too, Craig, is that, I mean, you're young. Like, this is not a long time in between, relatively within the history of, obviously the U.S., mankind. I mean, to make that kind of advancement over even the years that you're just talking about, even from you being a kid, that's still just a few decades, man. It's not that long time in between. And then, Sarah, you mentioned you have a pretty good package, right, that kind of talks about rockets. What do we have?
It just breaks down the specific rocket that they are taking to the moon and like what that launch is.
Is it the one that we ran during the weather desk?
All
right, I'm going to tell you, if you guys have a minute, okay, even if you're casually, maybe you've got us up, however you're watching us right now, and you were thinking, I'll just kind of leave it on, walk away. Check out this package. I mean, Eugene, if you
haven't seen it yet.
Oh, it's amazing. So you really get an understanding for what the rocket is, how it works, and some of the safety stuff. They talk about the escape hatch if something were to happen. Sarah, I thought this package was awesome this morning.
No matter how many space launches you have seen, you've never seen one like this, because the Space Launch System is a vessel unto itself. This is a beast. Taller than the Statue of Liberty from the base to the tip of the torch, well over 300 feet. It weighs around 6 million pounds, but that's okay because it can produce about 8 million pounds of thrust, starting with those two big solid fuel boosters on the side there. They will both burn straight through at the beginning, giving it that extra boost as it gets off the ground, and then they will fall away. They could almost get the job done entirely by themselves, but they will have the help of that big orange core in the middle. It's orange because that is insulation to keep what's inside very, very cold. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, both of which will be flowing down to these 4 RS-25 engines down below, all together sending this well up into space with a tremendous amount of power. So where are the astronauts in all of this? They're up here That's where you'll find the Orion Crew Module. Just below it, the service module that will supply water and oxygen and all sorts of things to the crew up above. And below that, another big booster, which will send that part into a giant elliptical orbit around the Earth before sending it on its way. One more thing, you'll see that upside down ice cream cone up there? That is a escape module, in a sense, a way for the crew to get out. Even when this rocket is going thousands of miles an hour, it could bring them safely back down to Earth. Of course, everybody hopes that this doesn't get used, that everything falls off as it should properly, and the Orion crew is on its way on this historic return to the moon.
You were right, Craig. That is pretty remarkable to even go down to, why certain portions of the rocket are built, colored the way that they are for, the safety, for the effectiveness, all of that. That was really neat.
Well, you look at that rocket and you go, okay, there's that orange rocket. Okay, that's just a giant, basically it's like a giant thermos.
Yeah.
I mean, they're trying to keep the contents insulated because you need that, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. That stuff needs to stay cold. So you've got these rockets firing off and you've got the ambient temperatures warm, as it's sitting there. They got to keep everything cool. Mm-hmm. It goes up, again, 700,000 gallons. Wow. It's amazing, all right? And then if you've ever been up to the Air and Space Center up in Hampton, you see they've got one of the little capsules there. You forget how small the capsules are when you see that massive rocket. The rocket on the launch pad stands, I believe it's a little taller than the Statue of Liberty. So, this is a tall rocket there on the pad, but the actual capsule's fairly small in the nose. It's good to know that even as it's ascending at these incredible speeds, if there was a problem and they had to abort the liftoff, that rocket is designed with that escape hatch with that escape module that it could break away and get them back to Earth safely. So again, I just think about the courage and the excitement, the preparation, the training that goes into this mission. And it's mind-boggling. And when the astronauts are ready.
And when they come back, the escape hatch, that's what they usually get out anyway. It's not just for emergency when they have to get out, right?
Well, I think that what he was demonstrating was the emergency escape hatch. They're coming back in, the modules I believe, for a regular splashdown.
Okay.
But yeah, I didn't see actually how the entire thing plays out. But I think that's actually specifically designed if they had to.
At an emergency, not just Well, we'll certainly.
And that might be something else, but I think that's the understanding. Again, the weather looks good. They can't launch through thick clouds. They can't launch through any precipitation. They can't launch if there is a lightning strike detected within 10 miles. You think, well, that's pretty far away. That shouldn't be a problem. Yeah. Lightning can travel off to the side 15 miles, even longer sometimes. But 10 miles, pretty safe bet. So they feel good about that. And right now, again, the launch weather favorability for liftoff is at 80%. The probability.
Yep. 6:24 is when the window will open and begin, is currently set. And so if you can bet that we'll be watching it for sure at that time, but you can also watch it on our streaming app. I do believe we'll have it on here, 13 News Now Plus, for people to have that opportunity to do so.
I'll tell you, I talked to Tierra and our news director in our morning meeting. We will carry it live on 13 News Now on the air
on
as
the
well.
air too? Okay.
So if you are watching any of our 13 News outlets, whether it's through the mobile app, which you can have and get our live streams right here on 13 News Now Plus with our live streaming and on air, we will be covering it. And hopefully they won't have to delay it. Sometimes they do.
Sometimes they do.
Yeah, I mean, it does happen. But I can tell you right now, I'm planning my day around making myself available to watch. And one other thing to note for our area in particular, if you are watching, certainly in eastern or northeastern North Carolina, you might want to look out to the south just to see. Okay, and I can't guarantee that you're going to see it, but it was believed that it may be visible if conditions are optimal, maybe even up to the Outer Banks or possibly Southside Hampton Roads. I know if it's up and it's going, I'm going to take a gander out just to see.
Just to see.
Yeah.
Give yourself a shot. Give yourself a shot. We got, just an exciting day altogether. At this point, we're just under, I believe, 8 hours, or just around 8 hours, I think, until the actual launch window open. So cannot wait for that. As Craig said, you can find it on our platforms. As soon as they launch, we'll carry that live on 13 News Now across the board. Craig, we appreciate you, man. Thank you so much. Good talking to you. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to have some guests to talk about a major issue that hemp retailers say they could face if the current cannabis retail marketplace bill does become law. And we're going to take you to Washington, D.C., where currently the Supreme Court is holding oral arguments on birthright citizenship, the president's push to change what is currently in the Constitution. We'll be right back after a few minutes. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with us here for Live Impact News. Let's give you a live shot right now in Washington, D.C. This is outside of the U.S. Supreme Court, where currently Supreme Court justices are hearing oral arguments over birthright citizenship here within the country. Now, historically, as it is currently has gone about historically here within our nation, a person only needs to be born within the U.S. in order to have the right to citizenship, regardless of who their parents are and their nationality. But the Trump administration is trying to push on that, to say that they would like to keep in mind what the parent's nationality could be. The president earlier today, leaving from the White House, expected to make history in being the first president to sit in to one of these oral arguments at the moment. So this is really big when it comes to our nation, the Constitution, and how justices look at this. Now, I will say to this point, when it comes to this particular amendment and this argument, all of the lower courts that have considered the case have struck it down. So we will see where the justices land within this for sure. But let's go ahead and listen to the oral arguments as they're currently taking place.
Is the key concept that creates allegiance. That's
General,
so
you said in your reply brief that the children of slaves who were brought here unlawfully, in defiance of laws forbidding the slave trade, would in fact be citizens. And we can imagine that their parents were not only brought here in violation of United States law, but were here against their will, and so maybe felt allegiance to the countries where they were from. And you say that the purpose of the 14th Amendment was to put all slaves on equal footing, newly freed slaves on equal footing, and so they would be citizens. But that's not textual. So how do you get there? You say it in just a few sentences, so can you elaborate?
Sure. If you look at I think if you look at the 19th century sources, what you see is that even though their entry may have been unlawful, 19th century antebellum law never treated their presence as unlawful. In fact, quite the opposite. One of the amici, in fact, points to like a Mississippi statute, which probably is replicated throughout the South before the Civil War, that says slaves in Mississippi have an indefeasible domicile in Mississippi. In other words, even if they run away, if they get away, Mississippi says, nope, you still live here. Right? And so it would be astonishing, in other words, for the opponents of the 14th Amendment to say, oh, these people were not domiciled and therefore it goes the other way, because actually U.S. law, even if they were brought in illegally and through an illegal slave trade, once they were there by
their intent is to return as soon as they can, let's say. So they're here, they're resident, and maybe under your theory, which says, well, lawfulness for a different purpose, but they're here, they're resident, let's take your assumption that they're not here unlawfully. But let's say they don't have an intent to stay. They want to escape and go back the second they can. Are they domiciled?
Under the 19th century law, I think this is the flip side of the hypothetical that we were talking about earlier. Under 19th century law, they are treated as domiciled in the United States, so it would be astonishing. And the debates in the congressional floor talk about not this specific case, but to say, look, slaves who have been forced to come here and have been here are lawfully domiciled here. They don't use the ways domiciled like they use allegiance. They say they don't have allegiance to, once they've been forced to come here, they don't have allegiance to any foreign or African potentate, and therefore
But General, how would that apply to the children of illegally trafficked people today? Would the same reasoning apply?
It would turn on whether the parents are lawfully domiciled in the United States.
So if they're brought in illegally, but then they choose to remain and they want to remain and they're domiciled, you would say that their lawful presence is not dictated by whether they were brought here lawfully or not. And that's different from someone who, say, crosses the border unlawfully.
Yeah, I think it would turn on whether their presence is lawful.
General,
in other words, obviously there may be many other important things that could be done to assist people like that. The question is, if they give birth to someone in the United States, that person naturally a citizen, that would turn, based on the original public meaning of the clause, on the lawfulness of their presence. Are they domiciled?
General, can I ask you a question? To follow up on what Justice Gorsuch was exploring with you with respect to domicile, did I understand you to say that domicile is going to be eventually or is controlled by Congress? Who is domiciled? I'm struggling to figure out who is domiciled in your argument.
The domiciliaries are people who are lawfully present and have an intent to remain permanently. So that's a kind of black letter, understanding of domicile. Now, Congress can dictate that certain classes of people, legal entrants and so forth, cannot lawfully lack the legal capacity to form a legally binding domicile.
But if that's so, then doesn't it make the domicile for the purpose of the 14th Amendment turn then ultimately on Congress's will in a way that the framers did not intend? My understanding was the framers put this citizenship clause into the Constitution to prevent future Congresses from being able to affect citizenship in this way?
Sure.
Very briefly, no, I don't think so, because it is up to the alien whether or not they want to be domiciled here. Now, there may be
But I
collateral
thought you just said Congress can make determinations as to who counts as being domiciled here.
Yeah,
So if that's true, then it ultimately would impact, in your theory, whether or not this person can claim that they have citizenship for 14th Amendment purposes based on Congress's determination. And I just thought that's what the 14th Amendment was trying to get away from.
If I may.
Yes, please.
Very briefly, I just point you to the discussion in Professor Werman's amicus brief where he talks about this is not a new problem. Going back even to the British common law, there's a situation of people who lack a safe conduct and are passing through the king's domains without permission. And he says the best reading of the common law is they are not under the protection of the king and they're not covered by the rule of birthright citizenship.
Thank you, counsel. You mentioned in your briefing and also this morning the problem of birth tourism. Do you have any information about how common that is or how significant a problem it is?
It's a great question. No one knows for sure. There's a March 9th letter from a number of members of Congress to DHS saying, do we have any information about this? The media reports indicate estimates could be over 1 million or 1.5 million from the People's Republic of China alone. The congressional report that we cite in our brief talks about certain hotspots like Russian elites coming to Miami through these birth tourism companies. And I mean, here's the fact about it that I think is striking. Media reported as early as 2015 that based on Chinese media reports, there are 500 birth tourism companies in the People's Republic of China whose business is to bring people here to give birth and return to that nation.
Having said all that, you do agree that that has no.
So we're giving you an inside here, a listen into the arguments right now inside the Supreme Court. And just again, to speak on how important this is to the President of the United States, he's making a presidential first inside of the courtroom as these oral arguments are being heard. That has not happened before in our nation's history. And we'll try to get back to that maybe later on in the stream if they are still taking that argument over birthright citizenship. But right now, we're going to switch gears to a very important topic to a lot of people here within Virginia. You know, Virginia will likely be able to start its retail recreational marijuana marketplace next year. A bill creating the framework for that marketplace for adults now awaits the governor's signature. But hemp retailers say that key parts of the bill would essentially shut them out of business, and they are urging the governor to make changes before this particular bill becomes law. Joining us today are Barbara Biddle, president of the Cannabis Small Business Association of Virginia, and Adam Dobbins, a retired Navy SEAL and owner of Grow Depot 757 in Virginia Beach. Thank you both for being here with us this morning. Barbara, I know that you are joining us via Zoom, and I will start with you. What's the issue that hemp retailers have with this bill, and what impact would it have on the hemp industry?
Yes, thank you so much for having me, and that's a great question. So, this bill essentially redefines hemp in a way that completely devastates the market. It's going to outlaw essentially over 80% of the legal products on the market, leaving consumers empty-handed, leaving businesses facing bankruptcy, closure. Employees are going to be looking at layoffs. And so we're urging the governor to pause and take a look at this redefinition and do it in a way that makes sense without devastation.
So, Adam, for you, you're a business owner in Virginia Beach. You have now heard about the components of this bill. Can you first explain to me what you all offer and who you help and what impact this could have on you and your business?
So we offer education and a lot of the safety regulations as well as growing help to our customers. So we have anywhere from older people from our community to freshly out veterans to college students to everyone in the community. So we're talking about everyone here in our community, the people of Hampton Roads.
And what's your concern if this were to pass? And have you heard already, even from some of the people that you serve, of how this could impact them?
I have heard from a lot of people. A lot of people that I serve at the store are really worried. They're confused and worried about their health. So right now, a lot of the local people and my customers are using, and veterans are using this for sleep, PTSD, chronic pain, cancer patients, and we're about to just rip the rug out from underneath them without having any other safe alternatives.
Barbara, this question is for you. You know, when we talk about the hemp industry in Virginia, how much money are we talking when it comes to this particular market per year?
I mean, millions, right? This market, it supports so many employees. It supports so many ancillary services. It supports so many mom and pop business owners. And so once we change this definition, all that is just gone. And there's limited access, there's limited opportunity to move forward. With the new market, we're looking at 350 retail licenses, which is a severe decrease from the thousands of retailers that we currently have in Virginia.
And you yourself, also a small business owner within this. So, I mean, this is something that would also, from what I'm hearing from you, directly impact you in that regard. But again, you're also the president of the Cannabis Small Business Association here within the state of Virginia. What role has your group had in discussions over this bill? And then were you made aware of this particular provision before it passed both chambers?
Yes, we've been meeting with legislators all year regarding this bill. We have been trying to make sure that there's a lane for small business, a lane for mom and pops to enter this market, and we were completely blindsided by this redefinition. We were promised that they would not touch hemp this year, and unfortunately, they slipped this language in during conference committee right before the General Assembly was set to vote on this bill. So we didn't have time to educate any legislators on the impact of this bill, and we were very disappointed with how this came to be.
And if you could clarify again, there's an issue of a time stamp with this too. There's like a 6-month gap that you all have an issue with as well if this were to go through. Can you clarify what that 6 months gap is and what the effect it would have?
Yes. So this bill would essentially, the implementation of the redefinition would start on July 1st. And this market's not set to start, or at least the adult use market's not set to start until sometime next year. And so there's going to be a large gap between when our businesses can offer these products and when potentially they might be able to find something that might be somewhat comparable to what they're using now. And even then, it could be much longer because it takes so long for a small business to start up. And these are not products that are currently being offered by medical facilities.
And then, Adam, as a veteran, you serve veterans who come to your store as well. When you hear from them, you talk with them, you see how your products, how clearly for them, they believe the products help them. What are your thoughts there if this is something that they would not have access to?
It's scary, to be honest with you. A lot of these veterans are looking for help. They've gone to the VA, they've gone to other avenues, and this is what's helping them. And we're literally about to rip the rug out from underneath them. So they're going to have a break in their health service, per se, because they're not going to know what to do with that time frame when they're waiting for the new legal market to work out, which could also drive them to using illicit and more unsafe products.
And so what do you want the governor to do? What would you like in this particular case that would help you and your business, you believe, those that you serve?
I think to have a more balanced approach instead of just going about this, as Barbara mentioned, that we weren't even ready for this. We weren't even able to educate our customers and our veterans and our community, is to have a more balanced and appreciated approach to where we're not just left with the rug ripped out from underneath us and no other safe alternatives.
And Barbara, I'll ask you the same question. If there's anything you could add to that, what would you like to see done here specifically by the governor?
I definitely agree with Adam. We need a balanced approach to this. There's other models that we can look at across the country where they have fair THC caps on hemp products. They're still accessible, they're still affordable to customers, and they're still safe. We also have to look at what's coming out from the federal government as far as potential Medicare and Medicaid coverage. Even that definition is much more generous than what Virginia is proposing. So we just need time for discussion. We need time for businesses to comply with this, to transition, whether it's to adult use or to exit. This is not something that can just happen on July 1 without devastation to our mom and pop businesses.
And if I'm not mistaken, I do believe the governor has until April 13th, mid-April, in order to make her decision and then also to make any changes within it as well. I'll just, for both of you, we'll start with you, Adam, if there are any kind of lasting words, anything you feel like you haven't been able to share at this point that you would like for viewers and others to be able to hear. I'll give you the floor, and then after that, the same for you, Barbara.
Just thank you for having me, and thanks for talking about this. Really important. It's a lot of jobs. It's a lot on the welfare and the community of our citizens and our veterans in the state of Virginia. If you can call the governor's office and get involved, a lot of people are unaware right now. So that's why I've said a few times, ripping the rug out from underneath everyone is just giving time and a better transition period for this, so people will be better prepared.
And Barbara?
Yes, I'm going to mirror what Adam said. Please reach out to the governor. Please reach out to your local legislators, your state senator, your state delegate. They need to hear how this is going to impact you. And I know that it's demoralizing. It's hard to stay optimistic, but it's really important that we reach out and we make our voices heard because they do care. They just need to hear from us.
Well, Barbara and Adam, thank you both for coming in and talking about this. I know how passionate you both are about this conversation and the impact it can have on you as well. And we'll see what happens from here. And if anything does change, of course, we'll be able to reach out to you guys and see your thoughts and reactions to that as well. Okay, everybody, we're going to take another quick break here on Live Impact News, but stick with us. Don't go too far away. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Welcome back. Okay, we told you that right now the Supreme Court is hearing oral arguments for birthright citizenship, the amendment there in the Constitution. The president attending that particular hearing, making a presidential first in the history of our country. But outside of the Supreme Court, there are protesters that are rallying, pushing for no changes to happen when it comes to whether or not someone who is born in this country is deemed a citizen. That has been the long-standing rule of law here within the country. Let's listen right now to some of those protesters who are outside of the Supreme Court.
Super clear. Vamos a ser bien claros de lo que está pasando en esa Corte Suprema. Let's be very clear about what is happening in that Supreme Court. This is not abstract. This is not theoretical. This is about who gets to belong in this country and who the Trump administration is trying to erase. Esto se trata de quién pertenece en este país y cuáles personas la administración de Trump está tratando de borrar. Este no es nada nuevo. Este país ha querido y ha conquistado y ha empujado para borrar la persona negra, la persona indígena, la persona latina.
So you can listen there. You can hear protesters again outside, and they have a visual there. That is Reverend William Barber there, well-known leader, civil rights leader across the country based out of North Carolina, who is there speaking with people at the moment. I'm not quite sure if he is part of the organization of all of this here, but certainly his presence is significant when it comes to this particular issue. What we will do now is go into the courtroom, let you listen to those oral arguments taking place right now by the Supreme Court justices. Again, this is on birthright citizenship, a major push by the Trump administration. So significant that the president himself is believed to be inside of the courtroom.
Show me what
time they are enacted. Everyone thinks that that phrase, due process, incorporates, the developing law of due process and minimum context and so forth, including from this court. So we think that's the best analogy when you're looking at the constitutional phrase itself and you take it out of a freighted context. The natural interpretation is to say this reflects the objective meaning of the Constitution, and the objective meaning of the Constitution is its original public meaning in 1866 and 1868.
Do you see any notable counterpoints to that argument?
I'm sure there are arguments on the other side. We addressed them in their brief.
So you're really, at the end of the day, then, this is a straight-up constitutional ruling you want from this court, win, lose, or draw?
Yeah, we think that the statute and the Constitution means the same thing. If the court disagrees, obviously we prefer an adverse ruling if the court's going to do that on a statutory basis than a constitutional basis.
But you just disavowed that in your responses to me by saying that that's not an available option, is the way I understood it.
Yes, the court would have to disagree with our statutory position, which is that it means the same thing as the Constitution. But if the court were to do that, then the natural course would probably be to rule on statutory grounds alone. Now, we think they mean the same thing, and we've got arguments for that, including, I think, the analogy I just referenced.
Thank you. Justice Kavanaugh?
General, how should we think about the text of the 14th Amendment, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, as distinct from the different language of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which refers, as you know, to persons not subject to any foreign power? Those texts are, on their face, different, and the history that Justice Kagan referred to might have developed quite a bit differently if the 14th Amendment's text had used the phrase that was in the Civil Rights Act.
That's an excellent point, and this court has held in multiple cases, Hurt against Hodge and General Building Contractors, has recognized that they were intended and they did mean the same thing, and that's powerfully reinforced by the congressional debates, where really what they're discussing is they said they were dissatisfied with the language in the Civil Rights Act because the phrase Indians not taxed they thought was ambiguous, and so they switched to the affirmative statement as opposed to the negative statement. The affirmative statement is subject to the jurisdiction thereof, but there's express statements in the congressional record essentially that we're doing the same thing, and that is what this court's case law has reflected.
Why didn't they say the same thing?
Again, it appears they preferred the sort of positive formulation subject to the jurisdiction thereof as opposed to not subject to any foreign power. And again, there's a deep concern and lengthy discussion of the potential ambiguity in the Civil Rights Act thing. They wanted to eliminate an ambiguity, but do the same thing. And I think that that's very strongly reflected in those debates.
By the time of the 1940 and 1952 congressional actions, where Congress repeats subject to the jurisdiction thereof, given Juan Kim Ark, one might have expected Congress to use a different phrase if it wanted to try to disagree with Juan Kim Ark on what the scope of birthright citizenship or the scope of citizenship should be. And yet Congress repeats that same language knowing what the interpretation had been. So how are we to think about that?
I think baked into that question is an understanding, I think that was reflected in Justice Kagan's earlier question, that everybody understood that Juan Kim Ark meant that, and the history I talked about, I think, refutes that. That really there's a consensus that goes our way for decades and decades after the adoption of the amendment and after Juan Kim Ark on the specific question of the children of temporary visitors. And it's really not until, and again, and their author in 1921 is saying, hey, the other side is the consensus.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
But there's executive branch interpretations and others. And if you're in Congress in 1940 and 1952 and you want to limit the scope of Juan Kim Ark or to eliminate ambiguity, why do you repeat the same language rather than choosing something different? For example, you could use the language from the Civil Rights Act of 1866 or some similar formulation if your idea in 1940 and 1952 was to not have ambiguity or not have an overly broad scope.
I think if you look at the structure of that statute, where it's 1401A and then B through H, A, and it says these are the people who are entitled to birthright citizenship. A is the constitutional standard, and then B through H are all the categories that Congress has super added to that. I think the natural inference is that Congress is codifying, which it was consciously doing in 1941, pulling all the naturalization rules and immigration rules together into one statute and said, you go to one place, here's who is a birthright citizen. A, those who are guaranteed that right by the citizenship clause, and B through H are the ones that Congress has added through its naturalization power. So that inference to me says A is merely, it's not trying to change or alter the constitutional standard, it's just saying, hey, the baseline is what the Constitution says, and we codify that, and then we move on to the new categories.
Of what relevance, if any, do you think Section 5 of the 14th Amendment has here that gives Congress the power to enforce the article, the 14th Amendment, by appropriate legislation? Does that give Congress room here, or do you not think so?
I do think that a ruling in our favor would leave room for Congress. I don't think you'd have to rely on Section 5. I think that Congress has its own inherent power to grant citizenship by statute. So if the court were to rule in our favor for the classes of individuals that they say should be covered, Congress has the latitude to do that.
How much room do you think Section 5 gives, if any, and it may not be any, Congress to interpret the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof or to define that? Is that relevant at all?
It's a great question, and I'm thinking about it for the first time. I assume it would be governed by the congruence and proportionality test from this court's case law. How that would apply here, I don't know. And I don't think it's presented because our contention is that the statute means exactly the same thing. If anything is congruent and proportional, it's that. And I think the court held that in the United States against Georgia.
You've mentioned several times the practices of other countries, and that's obviously, as a policy matter, supports what you're arguing here, but obviously we try to interpret American law with American precedent based on American history. That's certainly what I try to do, and I think you try to do. And so why should we be thinking about, even though as a policy matter I get the point, thinking about, gee, European countries don't have this, or most other countries, many other countries in the world don't have this, doesn't that? I guess I'm not seeing the relevance as a legal, constitutional, interpretive matter necessarily, although I understand it's a very good point as a policy matter.
Yeah, I largely agree with that, and you can view it as being raised preemptively, defensively. I'm going first, but obviously the other side in their amici say, make it a prediction, end of the world type predictions, and our point is, it's a very small minority of countries. Almost every country, and certainly all European countries, have a different rule, and the world hasn't ended there.
The other side, last one, the other side relies heavily, of course, on Juan Kim Ark, and you disagree with their interpretation. Oftentimes, when you are dealing with a constitutional precedent like this, you might argue, we disagree with that interpretation, but if you adopt their interpretation or agree with their interpretation of that precedent, you should overrule it. And you haven't made that argument here, and I'm just giving you an opportunity to explain why you haven't.
Because we think it's totally unambiguous in Wong Kim Ark that the holding relates to domiciled aliens. And so we strongly agree with the holding. We think domicile was the touchstone, and we think that's not a coincidence for the reason I maybe speculate a little bit when I was talking to Justice Gorsuch about how the dissent raises this, and then the majority's like, we're putting domicile in there, so we know that the absurd conclusion that they say would come from this isn't there. But also domicile as kind of the sort of relationship that creates this relationship of allegiance that makes you part of a political community if you're an alien from another country. That's deeply rooted in their understanding when they're doing it. They talk about domicile in Yikwo against Hopkins in the 1892 and 1893 cases, and there's this deeply rooted understanding, again, that goes all the way back to the early 19th century. So we think that's a really important conception. So I mean, we disagree with some of the dicta in Wong Kim Ark that we discuss, and we think there's dicta that goes our way that the other side overlooks. And we're not asking the court to overrule dicta. We just say don't follow erroneous dicta and don't apply it to this brand new situation that was not decided in Wong Kim Ark.
Thank you.
Justice Barrett?
So General Sauer, I want to zoom out a little bit and think about jus soli and jus sanguinis. So as I understand it, at the time of the 14th Amendment, those were the two dominant approaches. Jus soli, the English common law, roughly following the soil. Jus sanguinis, roughly citizenship following the parents. Now, jus soli was very generous on the soil, the English common law, and so it extended citizenship to those born there who may not have been born of parent citizens. But jus sanguinis, if parents who were citizens and had a child abroad, then that child's citizenship followed the parents. So one thing that's puzzling me about your argument when I think about the ratification of the 14th Amendment, in many ways it would have made sense for them, and you acknowledge the jus sanguinis in citing Vattel, it would have made sense in some ways for them to say, okay, we're going to follow, if they wanted to accomplish what you're saying they wanted to accomplish, you could say, well, we're going to follow jus sanguinis because we're going to make it all right on parentage. But instead, I mean, the 14th Amendment, we're talking about subject to the jurisdiction thereof, but it also says born in the United States. So you have the jus soli kind of point there, but you're saying it narrowed that point by tying it to the citizenship of the parents, at least as to soil. But I take it you're not arguing that United States citizens who have children born abroad would qualify for birthright citizenship. So it's kind of a narrower view of both the traditional jus soli rule and a narrower view of the jus sanguinis rule. So why would they have done that? And if they were going to invent an entirely new kind of citizenship, like an American brand, why wouldn't we have seen more discussion of that in the debates?
I think you do. And I would say, I think the right way to conceptualize it, it is a modified jus soli. Because even the British sources don't just say you're born here, you're a citizen. They say you're born here and you have to be under the protection of the sovereign. You have to have a relationship of allegiance. Allegiance is the word in Calvin's case.
But they don't focus on the parents. It's the child. And your approach focuses on the parents' allegiance.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's true of the 19th century sources.
It seems a little ambiguous, and I'm going to ask your friend on the other side of that question.
Let me point out then that there are two criteria. One is birth on the soil, and the other is allegiance or allegiance. What we have is birth on the soil remains the same, right? And so they are, and that's why so much of Wong Kim Ark is actually we agree with, because they are adopting a modified British rule. They are not going the French rule, that Vattel talks about, where it's like, who's the citizen? That had to be done by statute, as you pointed out, which it was in 1401. But what they've got is they say birth in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That is talked about as allegiance, allegiance, allegiance in the congressional debates, but they were clearly not incorporating the British feudal monarchical conception of allegiance where it's indefeasible. I mean, going back to the early 1700s, our nation had repudiated the notion that citizenship is indefeasible. The expatriation statutes from the late 1700s reflect that. And again, you look at the 1868 congressional report that we cite there, this is the same group of congressmen, Republican congressmen, and they say things like the U.S. Constitution itself is proof that Blackstone's theory of allegiance was not accepted. So they accept birth on U.S. soil, but then they take the concept of allegiance and give it its Republican, democratic, American understanding. And that's very, very, I think that makes a ton of sense.
Okay, and let's talk about its applications. So, there are some, I can imagine it being messy in some applications. So what would you do with what the common law called foundlings? The thing about this is then you have to adjudicate, if you're looking at parents, and if you're looking at parents' domicile, then you have to adjudicate both residence and intent to stay. What if you don't know who the parents are?
I think there are marginal cases. That one, I think, has the benefit of being addressed in 1401F, where it talks about
Yeah. But what about the Constitution?
Under the Constitution, domicile is a constitutional standard in all kinds of other situations.
Well, and it's hard.
Diversity jurisdiction, personal jurisdiction, sorry.
Well, yeah, and personal jurisdiction, 1332, diversity jurisdiction. And the thing is, it has to be litigated because it turns on intent. And both the virtue of both jus soli and jus sanguinis, whichever one you pick, it's a bright line rule. How would it work? How would you adjudicate these cases? You're not going to know at the time of birth for some people whether they have the intent to stay or not, including U.S. citizens, by the way. What if you have someone who is living in Norway with their husband and family, but is still a U.S. citizen, comes home and has her child here and goes back? How do we know whether the child is a U.S. citizen because the parent didn't have an intent to stay?
I'd say make 2 points, one practical, one legal. The practical point is under the terms of this executive order, you don't have to because the executive order turns on objectively verifiable things, which is immigration status. Are you lawfully present but temporarily present, or do you have an illegal status? So those kind of taking evidence, so to speak, under subjective intent wouldn't be done. And as to the constitutional point, obviously domicile is baked into a lot of constitutional and legal concepts, and there may be situations where facts are determined. But if you look at the guidance that all the agencies did after this court in Casa said the agency could go forward to issue guidance, the guidance provides, I think, very, very clear, objective, verifiable approaches to doing this. And so as a practical matter, I don't think it's presented by this executive order.
Thank you, General.
Justice Jackson?
Good morning, General. So I guess I am looking at your position in this case, and it boils down to requiring us to do at least these two things. One is believe that the framers were not importing the common law rule and understanding of birthright citizenship. And the second is to believe that what they were doing was departing from that common law rule in the way that you suggest. That is, they were seeking to have this turn on domicile. I think you have a number of hurdles to accomplish those two things. One of which, I think, is that when we look at this court's case law, and no one, I think, has mentioned Schooner's Exchange, but it appears that that was an 1812 case in which it seems as though the court had already accepted at the time of the ratification of the 14th Amendment that the allegiance that you were talking about was the English common law rule. That, in other words, allegiance meant that you are covered by the laws of the jurisdiction, that you can rely on that jurisdiction's protection. That's what allegiance meant. Now, you're saying today, no, allegiance meant something about loyalty or that kind of idea. But if the Supreme Court had, prior to the 14th Amendment, established that allegiance meant the common law definition, I think your first hurdle is to help us understand why we would believe that when the 14th Amendment was ratified, the framers weren't just incorporating what we had previously said it meant.
Page 572 of the congressional record directly addresses this. They say the concept of temporary and local allegiance from the Schooner Exchange is what is meant by, or temporary and local jurisdiction from the Schooner Exchange is what is meant by the word jurisdiction in the 14th Amendment. Senator Trumbull says, I thought about saying owing allegiance, but again, quote, there's a sort of allegiance from persons temporarily resident in the United States whom we have no right to make citizens. So he expressly and consciously rejected reliance on Schooner.
What do we do with, that's a debate, and it's a discussion, very valid, but then we have a subsequent debate between Fessenden and Wade where the same concept comes up, and it becomes clear, at least from Senator Wade's perspective, that that's wrong. So Fessenden, and I'm not sure whether these are senators, I apologize. Fessenden says, suppose a person is born here of parents from abroad temporarily in this country. Wade responds, the senator says a person may be born here and not be a citizen. I know that is so in one instance, in the case of the children of foreign ministers who reside near the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So it appears as though in that exchange, at least Senator Wade believed that the English common law understanding of what it means to have allegiance, to be a temporary person on the soil, was what was being adopted.
Yeah, that exchange strongly supports us. If you look at it in context, Senator Wade has introduced a version that says only birth on U.S. soil and doesn't have any allegiance or jurisdictional element to it. And so Senator Fessenden stands up and says, well, that can't be right because, obviously, what about the children of temporary visitors? It has this, it's another one of these statements that has this appeal to a background understanding that we all agree that the temporary visitors, their children do not become citizens. And then Senator Wade has to kind of backtrack and say, well, what about children of ambassadors? And in the end, Congress does not adopt Senator Wade's proposal. So we think that to the extent you can draw an inference from that, the inference strongly supports
All right, well, let me just ask you about.
We're going to continue to monitor that, but we just saw something pop on the screen here that's coming out of Texas, and we're going to go to that. You may have heard about the Texas killing fields, cases that go back almost 40 years. Right now, we're getting an update on that situation here just days after officials in Galveston County, Texas, shared a grand jury indicted a man with manslaughter and tampering in connection with a murder in 1984 and 1986. So let's go ahead and listen into that, and we'll try to get more information.
You have the press release with all the agencies involved, but I want to reiterate who helped with this case so nobody's left out. The League City Police Department, Hitchcock Police Department, Galveston County Sheriff's Office, the Texas City Police Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Dickinson Police Department, the Galveston Police Department, and the Santa Fe Police Department. Last December, I was approached by Mr. Tim Miller, who's the father of one of the victims, Laura Miller. I understand his concern, his frustration that there had been no closure to this case about Clyde Hedrick, who murdered his daughter, and James Elmore alleged to have assisted this in the disposition of her body. And at that meeting I had with Mr. Miller, I promised him that I would gather in all of the evidence that had been obtained to date since 1983, and I would take a new objective look at it, and depending on what evidence we had, we would seek appropriate charges against those persons and for those charges that we could prove. I'm here to tell you that we did that. I fulfilled my promise to Mr. Miller, but I had two of my ablest prosecutors in the office, Caitlin Willis and Adam Poole. This evidence was organized, reviewed, and that's what led to the charges yesterday. And I can also tell you that it wasn't just against Mr. Elmore. Clyde Hedrick, who died a little over a week ago, these charges on schedule had been prepared for Clyde Hedrick and for James Elmore. And but for his death a little over a week ago, almost 2 weeks ago, we presented his case to grand jury. I don't know, there was no ruling on that because he's deceased. But I'm telling you, there was no lack of effort to bring this thing forward, make it current, and go after those responsible. And so I want you to know that I'm very proud of the law enforcement agencies in this county today because all of those efforts, we got to this point. But I also want you to know that this is not over with. Just because Mr. Hedrick's dead, Mr. Elmore has been charged and he's facing his charges, there are other active leads in the case. Therefore, we're not going to elaborate on a bunch of detailed questions because there are some active leads in this investigation that can still be pursued to bring to justice some people who may have escaped justice thus far. And I also want to finish up by saying the efforts of law enforcement is also a testimony to the fact that some of these cold cases or unsolved murders that have occurred in the county that are not related to the killing fields cases, I ask anybody with information, any leads that could be brought forward to some of the area law enforcement agencies, do it, because I don't want anybody to feel like there's never that this is done, we're never going to solve this murder, therefore nobody's going to do anything about it. This is an example of, it took a while, re-examine the stuff, redouble our efforts, but we're able to solve one part of these murders. So nobody should feel demoralized or feel like nothing's going to be done or can't be done. Please provide all information to the law enforcement agencies available, because there are a number of unsolved murder cases in this county that still need to be solved. And we will, and I know the agencies will not give up. If we've got leads to act on and information to move forward, we will do it. And we will prosecute if we get enough evidence. So, thank you. We'll take a couple questions, but...
Has Mr. Elmore made any statements?
Sir?
Has Mr. Elmore made any statements?
Well,
Paraphrase.
nothing since his arrest.
Is there any evidence that you can share that links James to these actual crimes, anything at all?
Well, at this point, what's public record is what's in the indictment, the charges, what he was arrested upon. The defense will be able to obtain the discovery as soon as we know who the attorney is and move forward on that. And then at that point, once it becomes disclosed, we would be able to discuss that further. But since this is a pending case, I don't want to get into that until an attorney's been appointed or hired, discovery's been made, and that disclosure's already occurred.
Kenneth, you had said too that the looking into the other cases, in particular the Shonda Rambler case over in Santa Fe. Santa Fe PD last year was digging up on our property where she had been. Elmore was the last person seen with her. They have said all along that he was a lead suspect. That's going to be one of the cases y'all looking into, his possible connection there.
Yeah, we don't rule out any leads, any further investigation that we have at this point, so I don't want to elaborate on that.
How would you characterize the relationship between Elmore and the years?
Yes, sir.
How would you characterize the relationship? Were they friends, roommates, relations?
Who are you referring to?
Hedrick and Elmore.
Well, they were friends over the years.
For how long?
Decades. Since the 80s that we're aware of.
How much of an impact did Mr. Elmore's statements to Mr. Miller have on getting this investigation moving forward?
There are certainly statements that are made that will be useful in the prosecution of the case, but those were not the only statements made by him, therefore not the only evidence. There were other statements made by Mr. Elmore, and then we have other evidence that we would consider corroborating or backing up and proving up the truth of what he said.
You said earlier that Hedrick murdered Laura Miller. He hadn't never been indicted for murder. What changed that you can say that today that hasn't been able to have been said over the last 40 years?
Well, because I've only been in office, I haven't been in office 6 months. And so from my limited review and discussions with my prosecutors who have reviewed it thoroughly, there was additional evidence that was forthcoming that allows us to bridge that, which is in addition, includes the evidence against Mr. Elmore. He fits in the whole sequence of events. It's not just, these were separate events that occurred and can be isolated.
Kenneth, let me ask you real fast on Clyde Hedrick. He had just done an interview with the detective that was part of Bell's task force. He dies a few days later. Has there been a cause of death determined that y'all know of for that? Was it natural causes, suicide? What was it?
There was a finding in the hospital, is that exactly? That he took his own life.
Did he remove his trach tube? Is that how he did it?
That's the understanding of what happened from the doctors at the hospital.
In your presentation to the grand jury, was it for all 4 murders against Hedrick, or just Laura and Audrey, or was it all 4?
Yes, it was for all 4, and it included the activities of Clyde Hedrick as well as James Elmore.
So you felt confident that you would have gotten an indictment in all 4 murders against Clyde Hedrick?
Yes, I don't know what the grand jury, that's their ultimate decision, but I was confident we could have obtained that.
Okay, we're going to take one more question.
Sir, were there things that were missed over these past few decades that you would say led up to this indictment now?
things that were missed. No, this was a re-examination of what we had. There were some efforts here in the last couple of years that brought things a lot forward and solidified them, and such that we could do what we did yesterday.
Real quick,
That's it.
James
That's
Elmer's
it.
son-
Thank you very much.
We're done. I was just going to say, James Elmer's son spoke to us yesterday and said that his dad is going to send any message to him.
As they're walking out there, again, the update here is a Galveston County grand jury has indicted a 61-year-old man in connection with 2 murders that are tied to what has been called the Texas killing fields, one of the most haunting cold cases in Texas history, a stretch of rural land where the bodies of roughly 30 women were discovered over several decades. And you heard just some of the questions that were facing there for the county official. That man, his name is James Dolphs Elmore Jr., faces charges of manslaughter and felony tampering with evidence in the deaths of Laura Miller, and then also with tampering with evidence in the death of Audrey Cook. That according to Galveston County District Attorney's Office. And Sarah, you had heard about, these particular cases there, the Texas killing fields, and we were listening to the case. You were the one who flagged it. You saw it. That was happening at that moment. This has been going for nearly 40 years?
Yeah, and you described what Texas killing fields refers to.
Okay.
And I think because of the sheer amount of bodies that have been found along that stretch of highway, a lot of people aren't sure if it's the work of one person or if it's just multiple unrelated cases. But I do know that they had someone who had been arrested, I believe, in connection to at least 1 or 2 of those cases already, and he had died in prison within the last month.
Yeah.
And then today they indicted someone else because more than 30 women had been found along that stretch of highway over the course of a decade or 2. And then at least 4 of them were found in one specific area. And I think those 4 women were related to the man who was in prison and died earlier this month.
And I'm just looking at that man's name, Clyde Hedrick. His name was Clyde Hedrick, and I do believe one of the reporters asked, how did he die? And from what we just heard there, it sounds like it was suicide, died by suicide in that case, which I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions there. And I'm reading a quote here. This is from our ABC affiliate in Houston, who was able to speak with one of the fathers of one of the women who was a victim in this particular case. And he said after Hedrick died, saying, quote, "They let a serial killer die peacefully in his bed when they had everything in front of him," saying that he was very angry. He said he's almost 80 years old, and I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to stick around and face James Elmore, the man who has now been indicted in a courtroom. I am going to do that. That is coming from our ABC affiliate there in Houston. So quite the, new kind of information that's coming out of that case. I'm sure there's a lot of people who are really focused in on that, as you were saying, like that particular stretch of road having so many potential cases tied to it.
Yeah.
Major update.
Yeah, I always think it's incredible how, there are some cases that you see that after so much time has passed, you're like, I don't know how they'll ever solve this.
Man.
And so to see a case that's decades old have a lead now, it's reassuring, I'm sure, to a lot of the families.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. This isn't the first time we've been in this stream, and during the stream we've seen some major development that breaks on a cold case of decades. At least one other one has been in Texas since we've been here. We've covered a few others, but that's when and then even here in Virginia, right? And so when you start to speak about some of the developments, too, that you have in DNA and our ability to kind of test that and all these kind of things, the technology, and in some cases, just new leads just kind of come up after these task forces are created and you're able to get more information. It is, to your point, pretty incredible when you can make a major kind of breakthrough in a case after 30, 40 years. Okay, well, that is that new development there. It is 11:22. Sarah, let's go ahead and take another break here. We're going to be back. We still have much more coming up on Live Impact News. We're going to take you back to the Supreme Court, where the oral arguments are taking place over birthright citizenship. The president making history being inside that courtroom today. And then also, we're going to take a look at new polling that's coming out of a university in North Carolina at the president's approval ratings and who is currently leading in the North Carolina Senate race, according, again, to pollsters. We'll have all of that coming back in just a few minutes. Thank you for sticking with us here for Live Impact News. We're going to give you another listen inside of the courtroom as Supreme Court justices argue who should have the right to be a citizen when it comes to birthright citizenship. Should it continue as the constitutional amendment says at this point that anyone born in the United States, regardless of who their parents are, is considered a citizen, or should it be changed to consider the nationality of the parents, in which the Trump administration is arguing should be considered in making that decision? The president is making history by being inside of the courtroom as the justices are arguing this point. And outside of the Supreme Court, protesters are still rallying. Many speakers have been sharing their thoughts on the matter for at least the last hour. How about this? Let's start outside, and then we'll take you inside to the courtroom.
Us birthright citizenship. When the 14th Amendment was ratified, it rejected explicitly the effort to deny citizenship to formerly enslaved Africans. But it did not end there. It made clear that our sacrifice was meant to give rights to everyone born on this soil. And so we stand as the Legal Defense Fund, as co-counsel in this case with the Asian Law Caucus, with the ACLU, and with everyone here to say hands off the 14th Amendment. Birthright citizenship is our constitutional right, and I need you to say it loud to drown out the nonsense over there and let them hear it all the way to the White House. Hands off the 14th Amendment! 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 Thank you!
So you can see it's pretty animated outside of the Supreme Court right now. You can hear the ralliers for keeping the amendment as it is, and you can hear protesters who are speaking against the protesters, right? With one person in the back saying that they stand with the president. Well, let's go where the president, as what we last were told and believe, where he is, and that's inside of the Supreme Court as the justices continue to argue birthright citizenship.
To State versus Manual, which was the North Carolina decision that said, look, the rule in the United States from independence on has been the English common law rule. That explanation would be inconsistent.
But Ms. Wong,
yes.
isn't that explanation, I take Justice Alito's point, and I think he actually makes a good one in the sense that it could be that Justice Gray emphasized domicile to help the public accept the outcome of this case. You're suggesting that the emphasis on domicile was not a part of the rule, meaning he wasn't saying you had to be like a foreigner who is doing everything they can and who can't be naturalized, but he might have emphasized those facts in this case precisely because Chinese immigrants were unwanted, precisely because he had to get this out into the public, and people were going to say, whoa, you're saying these people have to, this baby has to be a citizen? And so one could imagine that it was important from a standpoint of helping people accept this citizen rule under these circumstances to emphasize that these particular people in this case were in Justice Alito's first category.
I think that is very possible, Justice Jackson, and as evidence of that, I would point to the fact that if you look at the briefing in Wong Kim Ark, you'll see that even though the parties had stipulated in the district court that Wong Kim Ark's parents were domiciled in the United States, when the case came to the Supreme Court, the government's brief argued that it was impossible for Chinese immigrants to have domicile because they expressed the view that was common among people who opposed immigration by Chinese nationals to the United States. There was a common view that Chinese people were inherently temporary sojourners in the country, And so I do think it's possible, Justice Alito and Justice Jackson, that he was trying to dispel that notion and tell the government.
Absolutely. That at least it reads as though he's trying to calm everyone down. These particular people were domiciled, but we're following the English common law rule. And when you look at the English common law rule, domicile is not a factor.
That's right. I think, who knows why the majority opinion mentioned domicile. We know is a stipulated fact. We know the government tried to renege on that stipulation and rely on this assumption on the part of anti-Chinese advocates at that time that Chinese people couldn't form a domicile in the United States, and he followed the English common law rule.
Ms. Wang, can I move? Oh. Go ahead. I just wanted to ask you a question about how the exceptions fit within the general rule. You've called them exceptions, and some of the common law sources call them exceptions, so I take that point. But if we think of use solely as tied to the territory, and we look at the exceptions as territorial in a sense, then they seem kind of like natural outgrowths of that rule, and this is what I mean, and this is where I want your help with how the exceptions played out in practice. If you look at Indian reservations as unique places because Indians were quasi-sovereign, separate nations in the American system, if you look at occupied alien territory as territory that's outside the jurisdiction of the United States, and then if you look at the diplomatic exception, almost like diplomats and their children had little bubbles around them, like the embassy is really the territory of that country, and even when they're traveling around, they're all not subject to the jurisdiction by virtue of this territorial fiction. Are those just applications of the rule? And if they are, then what happens to alien enemies like the German spies in Ex parte Quirin, or what happens to Indians who are actually not on the reservation but may be born, say, in Baton Rouge? How does the rule apply in those situations? Does it travel with the person, or is it tied in some sense to the land?
Sure. So let me answer each part in turn. So the thing that all of the exceptions have in common, again, is this sense that the person has this fiction of extraterritoriality around them. Let's set aside the Indian tribal exception for a moment and come back to it. So the example of enemy aliens, for example, Ex parte Quirin, is one that is answered by Justice Story in both Inglis and in Rice. And the touchstone under the American application of English common law was that in wartime, the touchstone is whether there's a foreign occupation of U.S. territory. So,
and that's, just to interrupt for 1 second to
Sure.
clarify, and that is territorial. Sometimes it just seemed to me that the rule varied. Sometimes it was stated as enemy alien, and sometimes it was focused on occupied territory.
Sure. So the rule, I don't think there's a separate rule for enemy aliens, and the government's briefs describe the exception as an enemy alien exception. I don't think that is the best way to think about it. Rice and English tell you that when the British forces are occupying Castile, Maine, no one is subject to U.S. jurisdiction there because Britain is governing Castile, Maine. And Justice Story explains, look, if the U.S. then retakes that territory, babies who are born to U.S. citizens by what he calls post limine become U.S. citizens. So that's the way to think about any wartime situation, enemy aliens or otherwise. As we heard earlier, Professor Muller's amicus brief tells us how we've thought about enemy aliens in wartime. Even in World War II, when the United States was detaining Japanese nationals who were deemed enemy aliens of the United States, when those enemy aliens had babies in these detention camps, everyone agreed that those babies were U.S. citizens. And Professor Muller goes on to explain that there are many cases of those U.S. citizens going on to a lifetime of government service to the United States. Everyone agrees those babies are U.S. citizens like everyone else. So again, the touchstone for enemy aliens is
So what about Indians? What about the Indian who's off the reservation or born off of a reservation?
Sure. So to start with the basics.
Okay, again, you were listening there to arguments taking place right now inside of the Supreme Court on birthright citizenship. This is a major deal and a push by the Trump administration so that we can take a look at whether or not that constitutional amendment should change that says that if you are born in the United States, you are a citizen and your parents should not be considered. The president, again, making history inside of the courtroom, the first time we've seen a president do so during oral arguments in American history. Speaking of the president, there are a lot of things right now that President Trump is spearheading and leading, and the question across a lot of different states and in our country is, how do people approve of how the president is performing right now? There was a new survey out of Catawba College with Catawba and YouGov that is looking into just that when it comes to how North Carolinians are feeling. And joining us this morning, we have Dr. Michael Bitzer, professor of politics and history at Catawba College and director for North Carolina Politics and Public Service. As always, it's great to have you with us, sir.
Good to be with you.
So let's get into this survey, which also looks into the big Senate race there in North Carolina. We'll get to that in just a bit, but let's start with the president. Obviously, the big thing happening right now is the war with Iran. How are North Carolinians approving or disapproving of, first, the president's performance and specifically what we're doing with Iran?
Yes, so we've been asking over the past year since last March an approval, disapproval rating of the president. And in this month's Catawba YouGov poll, right now the president is at his largest deficit in terms of approval and disapproval. He is sitting at 42% approval and 55% disapproval. And this is the largest gap that we have recorded. It's well outside the margin of error. So we can pretty much attest to North Carolinians have indeed turned against the president. This is trending nationally as well. Although I would say here in North Carolina, he has a slightly higher approval rating than what his national numbers are experiencing. But this is indeed a true test of where North Carolinians think about the president, and they have moved against him. This is typical in a presidential midterm year to see the president's approval ratings basically go underwater. But I think the issue related to Iran has certainly played into this factor as well. We're seeing that North Carolinians are very much against the president when it comes to the issue of military operations against Iran. We asked the question, do you agree or disagree that the U.S. was right to intervene militarily in Iran? 44% of North Carolinians disagreed with that. Only a third agreed. And so that kind of dynamic, I think, is playing into this issue with the president's approval and, more significantly, disapproval ratings.
You mentioned that historically we do see approval ratings dip when we get closer to the midterms. I've always just attributed to that to it's easier to blame the person who's currently in office for things that are going awry than it would be for a candidate who's trying to come in. That's been my longstanding kind of thought process on that. But for you, you've been doing this for a long time. Even though that has been historically the case, are you seeing anything different from this drop in approval ratings than maybe past administrations, even the president's past term when it came to the midterms?
Yeah, I think that this is a classic kind of dynamic in midterm elections. We have seen over the past 50 years only 2 midterms where presidents actually picked up seats in Congress. The general rule of thumb is that in midterms, voters basically have buyer's regret of whoever the president is, and they tend to move against the president and the president's party. We certainly saw that when President Trump was in his first term in 2018. Democrats did well in that context. So this is kind of fitting the historic norms. Now, Republicans are trying to combat that and try and insulate themselves. But I think over the next 6 months, it is going to be very difficult if the Iran situation continues And more importantly, economics tends to play a major factor in the calculus of what voters are thinking about when they go to the polls in a midterm election year. And if gas prices continue to go up, if that spreads throughout the economy and prices overall continue to move up, it is going to make a very tough political environment for Republicans and Republican candidates.
And we know that North Carolina, with its big military presence there, is directly now tied to this war in Iran. And even here in Virginia, we just saw in the last 24 hours another aircraft carrier that's going out into the Middle East. And we already have another based aircraft carrier there. So both communities very impacted when it comes to the military. A lot of families have invested interest, and I'm sure reading through some of the information that you all put out within the survey, that played a huge factor in this. But let's talk about the other big thing that's coming out of this Senate race, right? You got some major players that are going to be on the stage now that fight is set. You have obviously former Governor Roy Cooper on the Democratic side, and then you have Republican Michael Whatley on the GOP side of this. What did your survey see in terms of maybe early indications of where that race could be going?
Well, certainly this is an early indication. We are, 7 months out from November, but the time is ticking. And what we found among likely and leaning voters for November's general election is that Roy Cooper is garnering about 48% of the vote, Michael Whatley 34%, with about 14% undecided. And I think that there's a number of aspects we need to take into consideration. One, I don't see this being a major blowout come November. I think for North Carolina, we have a long history of being a competitive battleground state. This race will certainly tighten up, particularly as Republicans come back home to their party loyalty and to support Whatley. But this race is very much a critical race for Democrats to win, because if they have any expectation of trying to regain control of the Senate, they need Roy Cooper to be the next U.S. Senator from North Carolina. He is certainly garnering a lot of Democratic support. That's not surprising. But where the real contest, I think, will be fought out is among independents. And right now, he has a 48-27 advantage over Whatley. We haven't seen a whole lot of advertising. I have to caution folks in North Carolina, just wait. The onslaught will continue. Will start here very soon to fight the general campaign. But a lot of this early work, I think, is going to have to be about framing the candidates. And in particular, Michael Whatley has a very high don't know percentage behind his numbers. That opens up an opportunity for Whatley to define himself, but it also opens up an opportunity for Democrats and the Cooper campaign to frame Whatley in perhaps a negative light. So we'll have to watch and see how the dynamics of advertising plays out over the next several months into the summertime before the real heart of the campaign starts in the fall.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I went to college in North Carolina, Elon University. It's been about a decade since the last Democratic U.S. Senator out of North Carolina, correct? And since then, it's been Republicans for both of the senators out of the state.
Correct. 2008 with Kay Hagan winning when Barack Obama narrowly won North Carolina. She had a higher margin of victory over Elizabeth Dole, the sitting Republican incumbent. But since then, it has been Republicans controlling the federal races, President and U.S. Senate, with Ted Budd and Tom Tillis being our U.S. senators. This is an open seat election, and that oftentimes creates the most competitive kind of environment that we'll see in a midterm election.
And following up on that, two names I want to ask you their potential impact and what they do could have on this race. First, the president. You just talked about what those approval ratings say. How much does, how North Carolinians feel about him play into that U.S. Senate race? And then the other is the person who's leaving it, Tom Tillis, who has been recently ever since he said he was not going to continue within his role, very outspoken against the president. How much did those two individuals potentially play in what we see happen down the line in November in this U.S. Senate race?
Well, I think to take the president, all midterms generally become referendums on the president and the president's party. And right now, Republicans control both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. So it's a trifecta of unified government. But generally what we know is the president is going to bear the responsibility for the situation that the country is facing in the midterm election. And with these disapproval ratings, not just nationally, but here in North Carolina, I think it's shaping up to be a kind of classic, the president's party is going to suffer at the polls come November. How big of an impact that's going to be, we'll have to wait and see how things move through the summer. A lot of voters' minds get made up by the end of summer. So we're talking about, a pretty good chunk of the electorate will have their decisions made by the time we get to the general campaign starting in the fall. I think for Tom Tillis, his lame duck status has kind of opened up the opportunity for him to be critical and to hold the president and, more importantly, his administration to task. It's notable that Senator Tillis has gone after key surrogates, but not necessarily the president in all of this. Now, he has stated publicly he's not going to run for any future political office, but we'll have to watch and see how his approach to dealing with these issues, kind of influences. I would say that the president is probably going to be the more powerful factor in all of the voters' decision making rather than Senator Tillis. But Senator Tillis can kind of shape the dynamic of how Republicans are going to be reacting come the general campaign.
And I was looking over your survey and the results and saying that Tillis at this point, approval rating slightly underwater, 39% disapprove to 34% approving. And depending on the party, it goes the way you would imagine. Over one third of Republicans disapprove, while almost one third of Democrats approve of Tillis. Dr. Bitzer, is there anything else when it comes to either the race or even when it comes to how North Carolinians are viewing the president that you think we need to know? I know we got a few moments here. I just want to give you the floor.
Yeah, I think one other question that we asked 4 questions about the military operations in Iraq. And one of the questions that we asked was, do you support the deployment of U.S. troops on the ground in Iran? And certainly the military bases in Virginia, along with North Carolina, we're seeing an increased deployment of troops into that region. North Carolinians, at least, are heavily against putting boots on the ground. 58% of North Carolinians said that they disagree with supporting deployment of U.S. troops into military action on the ground in Iran. Only 18% agreed with that decision to deploy troops for ground operations, and it is heavily among Democrats. 73% are opposed. Among independents, 63% of them are opposed. Republicans are fairly evenly divided. 39% are opposed, but a third of Republicans would support it. If we end up with troops in operations on the ground in Iran, what I will be looking for in future surveys is, do Republicans rally behind the president and move into agreement, or are they very much against the president in terms of deployment? I think that's a critical component to all of this to watch into the future.
As always, Dr. Bitzer, we're so thankful for you to come in and talking with us. Dr. Michael Bitzer, professor of politics and history at Catawba College and director for North Carolina Politics and Public Service. Of course, we are going to be closely watching what happens with that Senate race and see how things happen within this midterm election. Thank you so much, as always.
My pleasure.
Always good to have him on again to give that context. He's so great at being able to explain what's going on, that new survey coming out here and showing how North Carolinians feel at the moment about what is going on in our country and overseas there in the Middle East. But the other big thing that's happening right now still, we got a few minutes left, so we'll let you listen in on it. Those oral arguments that are taking place inside the Supreme Court on what should happen when it comes to birthright citizenship. Should it remain the same, where if you are born in the country, you are a citizen regardless of your parent status, or should your parent status, should that be a factor in whether or not you get a citizenship? That's certainly what the Trump administration says should be considered. And the president today even going into the Supreme Court to listen to the oral arguments for himself. So let's do that. Let's listen to what the justices are saying, because it looks like they are still arguing the case inside.
Exchange between Senator Cowan and Senator Conness, where Cowan says, if we have this citizenship clause as part of the Constitution, we are going to encourage these gypsies, what he called gypsies, Roma, in Pennsylvania, whom he characterized as invaders, trespassers, and lawbreakers. We'll encourage them to come into our country because their children will be citizens. He says, Senator Conness, in your state of California, you will be facing a mass flood of Chinese immigration if we adopt the citizenship rule. And Senator Conness himself, an Irish immigrant, says, yes, and I am voting for that because I believe in citizenship by virtue of birth without regard to parentage. And the third point I would make is an historical one, which is that recall that at the time the framers are thinking about birthright citizenship, there had just been 15 or 20 years of unprecedented immigration from Ireland. The Know Nothing Party was dominant in the 1850s, just a decade earlier, and they were vehemently opposed to Irish immigration. They believed Irish Catholic immigrants were unassimilable and could never become Americans. But even the Know Nothing Party, members of Congress, believed that the children born in the United States to those Irish immigrants were citizens like anyone else. That's the intuition that the framers of the 14th Amendment had. Contrary to the government's arguments now, they wanted to grow this country. They wanted to make sure we had a citizenry to populate the military, to settle the country. And they also had an intuition that was consistent with the founding aversion to inherited rights and disabilities.
Thank you. Justice Gorsuch? Justice Kavanaugh?
On Lynch v. Clark, which you cite several times in the briefing today, which I appreciate, the government's response is that that decision was questioned at the time and went unmentioned in congressional debates about the 14th Amendment. I just want to get your response to that point on Lynch.
Sure, not true, though the Lynch was not specifically mentioned by name in the 14th Amendment debates. It was a couple months earlier in the debates on the 1866 Act, where Senator Lawrence talks about the great case of Lynch versus Clark, where it was conclusively shown that all children born here are citizens without any regard to the political condition or allegiance of their parents. And then, of course, they discuss the children of temporary sojourners elsewhere without mentioning Lynch.
Just want to isolate a point that you've mentioned, which is if the 14th Amendment used the phrase not subject to any foreign power, to give a much tougher argument. And then earlier, I think you indicated that that's what they meant, even though they didn't say it. I just want to give you a chance to unpack that, because I think that's
sure.
If it said that, I think our history would be a little different, and I think the text, even put aside the history, because that's speculation, the text would be quite a bit different.
Sure. So let me answer in three parts. The first is that Wong Kim Ark tells us that the court already dealt with this and said, look, the framers were trying to do the same thing with the language of the 1866 Act. To the extent you think that the language is ambiguous, or not as good, let's look at the operative text subject to the jurisdiction thereof. The second point I would make is that it's clear from the debates that the framers, in using the phrase not subject to any foreign power, were thinking about ambassadors. And I believe that Senator Wade at one point says, well, I wanted to start with the phrase, all persons born in the United States are US citizens. But then I thought, oh wait, we have these temporary visitors. In fact, the government points to this quote. He says, so there are these temporary visitors we can't make and we can't make their children citizens. That's ambassadors, and that's very clear from that.
So if that had been the text, your argument would be that was understood to be narrower than its text would read.
Yes.
But that's not the text, so I guess we don't need to deal with that.
Sure, and that brings me to my third point, which is you can't read not subject to any foreign power the way the government urges you to without making the children of all foreign nationals non-citizens, and that's clearly not what the framers were doing.
Justice Alito and Justice Kagan raised an interpretive question that I think is important, which is, are the exceptions, you've used the word closed many times, frozen, or do we reason by analogy to the exceptions that existed based on things that were unforeseen at the time? This comes up in the Second Amendment now, comes up in free speech law. Sure. And how do we think about whether it's possible that there could be an additional exception based on modern circumstances, reasoning by analogy to the exceptions that exist? I'm thinking in particular about the non-citizens unlawfully in the country, not the temporary part, but the non-citizens unlawfully in the country.
Sure.
Could you reason by analogy? You've used the phrase several times, I think, the fiction of extraterritoriality, and could that apply, and if not, why not?
Sure. So here, I agree with Professor Whittington, who says that the government's position here is not positing a new application of the rule, but a challenge to the rule itself.
Okay, we hope that you've been able to listen in intently to this argument that is certainly going to make a big splash when it comes to our Constitution. What should determine birthright citizenship? That is going to be the question in which these Supreme Court justices are now hearing and will later decide. Will they act like the other courts that have already heard it, the lower courts, which have struck down this attempt? We will certainly see in several months. But before we get out, I did want to mention that Wednesday, today, is actually National Walking Day. It is first Wednesday in April to promote heart health and physical activity. And I say all of that to say, please stay healthy, get some steps in. You heard Craig earlier with her forecast. It's going to be nice out there. Sarah, it means you got to get out and walk.
I know. I was just telling Eugene that I have been walking almost every day, but